Díríomh in úsle agus fáilte go dtí an licht seo an nacht atá geile lá damhanda na magach. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this evening for this talk, which is celebrating World Wetlands Day 2022. We are joined this evening by John Lusby of Birdwatch Ireland. Birdwatch Ireland, John, last year undertook a bird survey of Ardagullion Bog, which is a special area of conservation, wetland here in County Longford, very close to Edgeworthstown. And we have a video up on our YouTube about that last year. But John tonight is going to look at wetlands and the birds of the wetlands in this talk this evening. Wetlands are very significant features of our landscape. We have a lot of cultural ties with them. They are very important for carbon sinks as part of our climate change awareness and action programs, but also they're incredibly important habitats for many species, including birds. And John is going to discuss birds primarily this evening, and I hope that you will enjoy that. I am going to hand you over now to John Lusby of Birdwatch Ireland.
Oh, there we go. So thank you very much, Mairead, for the introduction and for inviting me to talk. And good evening, everybody. And I'm delighted to be talking this evening. Very appropriate, given it's World Wetlands Day, or the week that contains World Wetlands Day. And I'm going to be talking about birds on the bog. And I'm from Galway myself, but last summer, as Mairead mentioned, I got to know parts of Longford quite intimately, and particularly one site, which is Ardagullion Bog, which is, if you're not familiar with the site, it's absolutely amazing raised bog and in Longford. And I know you are blessed with quite a few raised bogs, but this one in particular is an incredibly precious site. And we were carrying out bird surveys to assess the bird species that are present on Ardagullion Bog, and that's going to be the main focus of the talk this evening. And just to give you, if any of you are unfamiliar, an idea of the bog itself and where it's situated. So close to Edgeworthstown, as Mairead said, and you can see here the area of focus is this small area. It's quite small, quite compact, less than 120 hectares, and you can see just the taking a view back that it is, surrounded by other bogs. And I know in general Longford is not short on wetlands, but this particular site, and even just looking the bogs surrounding, you can see that they've been worked on more. You can see the where turf has been cut. But back here in this area of focus, Ardagullion Bog, it still has an area of intact raised bog, and probably fair to say one of the raised bogs that's in the best condition in the country. So incredibly important site, and as I say, we really got to focus in really comprehensively to look at its importance for birds, and obviously important from many aspects. But I'm going to be focusing on the bird life on Ardagullion Bog. And to take a step back, this map shows the bogs. So we have three main types of bogs in Ireland. We've fens, and then we've got raised bog and blanket bog. And raised bogs are typically confined to the central plain, typically the kind of the midlands, and they're accumulations of deep peat up to 12 meters, and which formed after the last glaciation, after the last glacial period. And it's the blanket bogs, then they're more confined to the mountainous, typically the western areas. So we're incredibly blessed in Ireland in that we have such a high proportion of peatlands in general, made up mostly of our raised and blanket bogs. And in fact, our proportion of peatlands, it's close to 17%. In the European context, it's only exceeded by Estonia and Finland. But unfortunately, most of our bogs, both blanket and raised bogs, are in poor condition. So that's why a site like Ardagullion that still has intact active raised bog, it really is absolutely precious. And so raised bogs, as I said, they're just like their name implies, they do form a dome shape, as you can see here. So formed over many thousands of years, and since the last glaciation period. Some are raised bogs, up to 10,000 years old, and they formed where there was shallow lakes that were infilled with vegetation, and then gradually over time this developed into the dome shape, which is primarily fed by rainwater. So that gives rise to quite acidic conditions, and therefore unique plants that use raised bogs. So typically raised bogs, they're quite low in species diversity, but the species that do occur there, there's many species that occur on raised bogs and nowhere else. So the active raised bog is an Annex 1 is a priority habitat. And if we go back in time, there was once over 300,000 hectares of active raised bog in the country, and that has been dramatically reduced. It's estimated a reduction of 99%. So it really, and that is from activities such as turf cutting, afforestation of non-native conifers, drainage, large scale extensive drainage schemes. So most of our bogs are lost or in poor condition. So the ones that remain, they really are precious. And I think we've slowly awoken to that fact. But it did unfortunately take some time. And so there has been some efforts recently to preserve and to restore some of our remaining raised bogs. And there has been a really important project, which I'll talk about shortly, the Living Bog Project, which focused on restoration of 12 bog special areas of conservation, and one of those is Ardagullion Bog. And this just shows the so many of our raised bogs are now designated as either special areas of conservation or NHA's natural heritage areas. And Ardagullion Bog is an SAC, it's a special area of conservation, and it has been the focus of restoration over recent years through the Living Bog Project. And it's amazing. It was, from my perspective, really reassuring to be to become familiar with a site and to be working on a site that is the future is is secured, that the site is protected, but that on top of that, it's actually the site is likely going to improve over time. So it's really heartening to see that. And as part of the restoration works, it focused on this area, which is quite a small area. It's one of the smaller raised bog sites that the Living Bog Project focused on. So as I said, just under 120 hectares. So quite small, but absolutely precious, and quite an extensive area of active raised bog, of active living raised bog, which is very rare for raised bogs in Ireland. And as part of the restoration works, because this is really why we wanted to focus on Ardagullion Bog, because restoration works, it has many benefits restoring the bog, and it's all about re-wetting the bog, restoring the water table, because one of the most damaging things to raised bogs is drying it out through drainage, and in order for active raised bog to continue to grow, it needs to be wet, it needs to be able to support the sphagnum mosses in particular. So the main focus of restoring raised bogs is exactly that. It's restoring the water table, it's re-wetting the bogs, and through the Living Bog Project, that's been informed by quite complex hydrological models, but the actual practicalities of it are much more basic. And you can see here this is a peat dam, and this helps to restore the water table. And there's actually there's over 700 peat dams have been installed on Ardagullion Bog, which is a huge amount for the small size of the bog. And then, as I say, that helps over time, and it can be a gradual process for the water table to increase, to restore, and for the more natural conditions to return, and to support actively growing living raised bog and the species that depend on those conditions, on active bog, active raised bog. And there is, even though the project has only been in operation and the restoration work started since 2017, it's amazing to see some of the results even over the short term. And this will give you a very basic but visual understanding of the benefits and of the restoration works. And this was a map that was shared with me recently by the Living Bog Project, which show the condition of the bog based on the ecotopes, the habitats on the bog in 2016 before the restoration works, and then over just a very short period of time, a little over 4 years, that the area of active raised bog was shown to increase by 25%, which is phenomenal for that short period of time. So that's, as Mairead mentioned, raised bogs are hugely important habitats and for the ecosystem services that they provide, and such as carbon sequestration as well as water filtration, flood prevention. So by restoring our raised bogs, such as Ardagullion, there's many benefits, not least for biodiversity. And what we wanted to do was to see, firstly, how important this site was for birds at this moment in time, but also as well to try and predict, how the bird species present may be affected by the restoration works over time and by the inevitable changes that are going to occur and already have, as you can see there, occurred on the bog because it's going to become wetter. The area of active raised bog is going to increase. And increase further, hopefully. So important to establish, just how that's likely going to impact the bird species present, and as well these sites, and particularly a site that's still relatively intact like Ardagullion Bog, are so important, and as you'll see soon, for birds. And our list of birds of conservation concern, the group of species that are most represented on the red list, which are those that we're most concerned about, are birds of uplands. So open habitat specialist species that we'll be talking about, and including those that are associated with and some dependent on sites like these on raised bogs. So hugely important. And from our perspective, we wanted to figure out just how important, and also how the restoration works was going to impact breeding birds on the bog to inform future restoration projects and the management of this and other sites. So that's what we set out to do, with support from Mairead from Longford County Council and through the National Biodiversity Action Plan Fund, and also with the Peatlands Community Engagement Fund. And it was amazing to be able to focus in such detail on a site, and the aim of our surveys really was to record all the breeding bird species present and their habitat associations. And it's probably fair to say is one of the most comprehensive surveys on raised bogs in Ireland to date. And as I say, the area of focus, it's quite a compact site, so the area of focus was quite small, and that really gave us the opportunity to really look in great detail. And to do that, we employed several different survey methodologies, because obviously the bird species present, some of them are quite difficult to detect. Species such as Merlin, which are notoriously challenging to survey. And also as well, there's difference in time patterns in terms of some species present are only active at dusk or even after dark. So we tried to we tried to design the survey to cater for all the different species present and their detectability. So we used 5 different survey methods, which were Transect Surveys, Vantage Point Surveys, and Roving Surveys, and then 2 specialist species surveys. So surveys specially designed to try and detect woodcock if they were present, and also surveys especially designed to try and detect long-eared owl. And I'll just run through the different surveys that we used and the basis of them. So Transect Surveys we used across the high bog itself and across the open bog. And essentially Transect Surveys are walking a prefixed line, as you can see there, the black lines, and recording all birds that we encountered either side within certain distance bands of the main transect line. And then through what's called distance sampling, we're able to work out the breeding densities of some of the more common species present. So this was walking the transects across the high bog itself. And these are the species that we recorded. So 29 species in total on the Transect surveys. And then obviously the perimeter sites are the surrounding woodland and scrub, which weren't covered as part of the Transect surveys, are obviously really, really important as well for birds, and we wanted to cover those, and we did those through both the Vantage point surveys and roving surveys. And Vantage point surveys is essentially picking a suitable vantage point and watching the habitat within view to detect the species present. And that's more so for species such as raptors, the likes of Merlin and Kestrel and Sparrowhawk and Buzzard, and corvids like raven and hooded crow, but also as well breeding waders that might be using the interior of the bog. And then roving surveys, because particularly these sites and Ardagullion, which is great and which is exactly what you want from a raised bog, but there's many areas which are very wet, which are inaccessible. So but as well the kind of scrub woodland surrounding the bog, which can be really, really important and have a good diversity of species. So to cover those, we used roving surveys, which was essentially walking around those areas, not along predefined routes such as Transect, because it's just the access is much more difficult, and you end up having to kind of come back on yourself and walking around pools and areas of dense scrub. So walking kind of more random route and recording all the birds that we saw and heard in those areas. And we recorded 39 species. You can see the route there. Are on the roving surveys, and that was using for all these survey methods. We had an early visit, typically in April, and then a later visit from around mid-May. And then we used Woodcock surveys, which was a defined single point that we looked over at dusk to record woodcock in flight or calling or loading woodcock. And then also long-eared owl surveys, which, because they call it night, was after dark, walking around the edge of the bog and trying to come within hearing distance of all the suitable breeding habitat for long-eared owl. So if they were nesting close by, in the conifer plantation and in woodland, that we would hear them. And the best time for long-eared owl surveys is from May onwards, and on nice still nights that the calls carry. And this is a long-eared owl chick, and this is the sound that we're listening for, which is the long-eared owl calling, which is music to my ears. But and that noise can carry quite a long way on a still summer night. That can be you can hear that up to a kilometre away, sometimes more. But also as well, in addition to long-eared owl, also as possible, there's many other species that are active and that are calling and vocal at night, such as snipe, such as grasshopper warbler, such as sedge warbler, woodcock in the early part of the night at dusk. So as part of all the surveys, we're recording all the species that we encountered. And in total, this is looks quite chaotic map there, and there's loads going on, difficult to decipher. But I'll go through many of the main species individually. But just goes to show you just the density of species. And in total, we recorded 42 species, both on the high bog, the cutover areas, and also the surrounding the surrounding habitats around the edge of the bog. And that's quite an impressive number. But what is more impressive is when you look at the breakdown of the species, and which really emphasizes just how important this site is, in terms of its conservation value, specifically for birds. So out of those 42 species, 5 are on the red list of birds of conservation concern. So essentially 12% of the species that we recorded are red listed birds of conservation concern, and another 9 on the amber list. So both combined, the birds of conservation concern, both in the red and amber list, are made up over a third of the species present, which really shows just the importance of the site. And sorry, I should mention the basis of the birds of conservation concern. So essentially, the birds of conservation concern is we categorize all species that are present in Ireland, all bird species, according to a traffic light system. So red, amber, or green. And it's based on very specific criteria, but essentially the species that are on the red list are those that are of conservation concern, just like it says in the tin, that typically their populations have declined, and they're species that we are worried about, and that they have suffered population declines and are on a downward trajectory. Amber listed species similarly have suffered declines, but not to the same extent as red listed species. And then green listed species are those that the populations are doing reasonably well, or that we're not as concerned about. So just to and there are many more species on the green list than there are on the red list. So the proportion of birds on the red list at Ardagullion Bog really shows just how important it is. Sorry, just to interject. Sorry, Mairead, if you can hear me there. I got a notification that there's people waiting in the lobby. So just in case there's anyone waiting there.
Yes, I'm having difficulties letting him in. That's the problem.
Okay. I was just checking, but I think if the notification is gone there now, so maybe they've managed to access. But I shall plough on, and hopefully they're with us now. So, anyways, now to it's all well and good looking at the facts and figures in terms of the number of species and all that, but I suppose it's more interesting really to look at the individual species that are present, and as I say, that the list itself is really impressive, but also the actual individual species that we recorded. And the most common species that we recorded was the meadow pipit, and that is quite standard for raised bogs that are in reasonably good condition, and they can typically make up about 60% of the bird encounters on raised bogs, particularly on the high bog and cutover bog, and that was the case at Ardagullion. And so these are, a good indicator species, meadow pipit, and also, a really important species because, in their own right, but also, they're, a prey species for some of the raptors, say, for example, that I'll be talking about, such as Merlin, such as Kestrel, such as Sparrowhawk also. And we were able to work out, based on the Transect surveys, the breeding density of meadow pipit, which we estimated 146 per kilometre square. And that allows us then to compare, to other sites, and also, to compare, because, as I say, meadow pipit, based on their abundances and the numbers they occur, can be a really good indication as to, the health of the bog, the status of the bog, and those breeding densities compared well with other raised bogs, and including other raised bogs that we looked at using the same methods last year. The second most common species, and again, it's what you would expect, and I suppose what you would hope for. The second most common species on Ardagullion was Skylark, and didn't occur in as high densities as meadow pipit, which is again quite typical, but the densities they did occur in were quite were quite good, and particularly compared to other raised bogs. And this is, it's a characteristic species of bogs and of bogs in general, and of raised bogs. And it was just, it's a really, captures the sound of bird song on raised bogs, and that was definitely the case in Ardagullion. This is the sound of their fantastic songsters, Skylark, fly really high up in the air. Sometimes very difficult to spot, their types, and will blast out this song for many minutes on end at times before coming back down to the ground. And it's a fantastic song, to hear as part of the dawn chorus early in the morning. They're beautiful songsters. So, and they are, an amber listed bird of conservation concern, meadow pipit being a red listed bird of conservation concern, and Skylark occurred a breeding density of 83 per kilometre square. So less than meadow pipit, but again in quite healthy breeding densities. And then another bird which occurred in quite good numbers on the bog was snipe, and they are another bird that are a recent addition to the red list of bird of conservation concern. They were added to the red list because of quite extensive population declines on a national scale, in recent decades. So they're added to the red list in the most recent iteration of the birds of conservation concern. And you can see here the map on the left is map from the Breeding Bird Atlas, and the Breeding Bird Atlas is a survey carried out every 20 years in both Ireland and Great Britain of all species present. And there's been 3 breeding bird atlases now, and the first one in the late 60s, early 70s, and the most recent, which was carried out in 2007 to 2011. So it's one of the best ways of tracking changes in distribution and abundance of birds over that time frame. And it's one of the main sources of informing which species are doing well, which species aren't doing so well, and ones that we should be concerned about. And if we look here, this is the map showing the distribution of snipe from the first breeding atlas, so late 60s, early 70s. And then when we fast track to not so long ago, to 2008, 2007, we can see it's quite a different story. It's quite signifies quite extensive declines in Ireland as well as Great Britain, and as I say, because of that, or at least one of the reasons, it's been added to the red list of birds conservation concern. But again, another characteristic species of bogs and of raised bogs, and another sound that is really, really characteristic, an amazing sound to hear. And I'll play their sound now. And this is snipe drumming, and it's actually in parts of Ireland it's referred to. I think sometimes the Irish names are much better and far more descriptive and capture the species much better than the English names. And the snipe is often referred to as the bleating goat in the sky, and you'll hear why in a minute, because it does resemble the sound of a goat bleating. And typically when they're making that sound, it's very hard to get a visual on them to actually spot them. And they will also make that sound at at night time and in low light conditions. And it's actually not a call, but it's actually the sound of the wind when they dive down at high speeds, reverberating through these feathers here. And an amazing sound here. And again, all too uncommon in other parts of the country, but a sound that was ringing out, in the evening, in the early morning, on Ardagullion. And we estimated that they carried a breeding density of 7.5 per kilometre squared, which may not mean a lot, but we were able to really good information because we were able to compare that then to other sites, and other sites of other raised bog sites, in varying condition and varying status, and that did that those estimates did compare favourably. But definitely one of the stars of the show, and one that we're at record was another breeding wader, was this guy Redshank, and it was one that is, you saw the maps of the decline of snipe, but the decline of Redshank has been so much more dramatic, and they are another red list of bird conservation concern. The one that their numbers have really, fair to say, reached a critical point in terms of breeding pairs, and only a few hundred breeding pairs remain. So again, it just shows just how important a small site like Ardagullion is, and it was one of the probably the most exciting finds of the survey was recording breeding redshank on the bog. And just to give you an idea just how precious the fact that they are breeding on the bog is, this is again the map showing the distribution of redshank from the first breeding bird atlas in the late 60s, early 70s. And then again, if we look more recently, you can see just how few they are. The small distribution. There's a cluster around the Midlands there, kind of around the Shannon Callows in that area. But very and even probably fair to say since that time, since 2008 to 2011, which is more than 10 years ago now, that that the situation is is likely fared even worse. So again, the fact that they are present breeding on Ardagullion Bog is just it's fantastic, and probably one of the most exciting finds of the survey. Another species characteristic of raised bogs and characteristic sound of raised bogs is this fella there, everyone know, which is the cuckoo, and beautiful sound to listen to. I'm sure will take some of you back to your childhood days. But again, very, very common sound on Ardagullion, whereas it disappeared from maybe more intensive areas, intensive parts of the of the country. So cuckoo, a green listed species, but there has been declines in certain parts of the country. And then another one again, which was a really good one to find, which again does occur and breed on raised bogs, but definitely not not to be expected in all, and not all raised bogs, is teal. And we recorded teal on Ardagullion Bog, which is an amber listed bird conservation concern. Another species, and one I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, is Kestrel. And again, another one that the name in Irish just captures it far better than its English name, and its name in Irish, on Puckaragriha, which is the wind puncher, and that essentially describes what it's doing just there, which is it's hovering, and they can hover, particularly when there's an updraft of wind, almost motionless, and that's their one of their hunting techniques, which they're hovering and scanning the ground beneath for subtle movements of small mammals, the likes of bankbowls, shrews, or lizards, or even invertebrates. And the Ardagullion regular site, watching them hunt over the bog, over the high bog, and they were nesting, they were breeding close by. Kestrel is another species that it's similar to snipe. It's a recent addition to the red list of the birds conservation concern, and that's because there has been a slow but steady decline in their populations going back over the last few decades, probably for multiple reasons. Land use changes, habitat loss possibly as well, increased use of rat poisons, of rodenticides, but it is one that their populations unfortunately going in the wrong direction. But they still are very, very widespread, and you can see here, this is from the original breeding atlas, where they're pretty much spread right throughout the country, pretty much ubiquitous. And but there has been, and again, it's typically with species that are very, very widespread, that it can take time to see the extent of the declines and see the the extent of the problems. But Kestrel is one that we have picked up on, that things aren't going in the right direction, and it's important to understand why that is, and what we can do to reverse those declines. But on Ardagullion, the birds there seem to be doing well, and regular sight, as I'd say, hunting over the high bog, as was Sparrowhawk, which was more along the perimeter, along the edges of the bog, and the woodland and the scrub woodland. And that was one again that was regularly seen, and particularly in the early visits, soaring on nice warm sunny days, and several encounters of it hunting as well. So Sparrowhawk are green listed bird conservation concern, very widespread throughout the country, and one that you would expect, similar to Kestrel, you would expect to find, and obviously we did. And then this one as well, and again, this is Buzzard, and another species that you very much you before starting the survey, you at this stage with Buzzard, you're going to come across them, and you expect them, but it's still you almost forget just how amazing their story is and their recovery is. And buzzards, they might be an expected sight and a common sight nowadays, but you don't have to go that long back, to a point that they weren't at all present, anywhere in the country. And obviously, so they're a species, they're a native bird of prey to Ireland, but we completely lost buzzard as a breeding species, going back maybe 120 years ago or so, or a little more, and they were essentially wiped out. They went extinct as a breeding bird in Ireland. And back from the 1950s onwards, birds slowly started to move over from the west coast of Scotland to Rathlin Island first, and then the short hop to the Antrim coast, and then they've slowly spread westwards over towards Donegal and also eastwards down along southwards down along the east coast, and to gradually spread west. So now I'm sure you're all very familiar with them in Longford, and this map even doesn't. This is quite outdated now. This is even though it's only from a little over 10 years ago, but they've colonised right out west, and so it happened over a short period of time. It just goes to show, that it's kind of the landscape in terms of birds is ever evolving. While we're certain species we're very concerned about and their populations are declining, other species have colonised or recolonized, the likes of buzzard, the likes of great spotted woodpecker, the likes of little egrets which colonised. So it's ever evolving, and that just shows the importance of tracking the changes over time, and definitely with buzzard, it's definitely one of the the success stories, and important to remember that and appreciate that when we do see them. But that was one again that, as expected, was quite a common sight over and around Ardagullion, and as was this bird raven, which I think are an underappreciated bird. They're a magnificent bird, incredibly intelligent bird, and at this time they're one of our earliest breeding species. So February is the breeding season essentially starts for raven at the moment, and now is the time that you see them displaying and courtship flights, which is absolutely amazing, tumbling, really impressive aerial displays and tumbling in the air, and calling the characteristic and hunting call. So they were quite a frequent sight in and around Ardagullion as well. And then there were several species, many species that that again were quite characteristic of raised bogs, and occurred in good numbers. And some of these that I'll talk about now, more so not on the high bog itself, but more so around the edges and around the perimeter habitats. And this is one which is Grasshopper warbler. Again, one that we came across mostly during the nocturnal surveys, and they do call during the day, but also at night, and maybe a bit more obvious at night when other species are quieter. But they've a really characteristic call, which is a long kind of reeling call, and sounds like a fishing reel, but which you can listen to now. And it's a really cryptic call as well, so it can be difficult to decipher where it's coming from. Kind of like corncrake, or if any have heard those species before, where you think it's coming from a particular direction, you might start walking that direction, then you realize it's actually coming from completely the opposite direction. So it tends to, and that's obviously to protect them, conceal their location. Difficult bird to spot. Typically, you see them, but you don't. You hear them, but you don't see them. Blackcap. Again, this is a bird that has, really. Firstly, they used to be solely, a migrant to Ireland. Now we're getting more and more birds overwintering, spending the whole year here. But just seem to have become more and more common in recent years. Beautiful songster as well, and one that was just, a really characteristic sound around the kind of the edge habitats of on the bog, as was this one, which is Willow Warbler, one of the more common species. And again, a really characteristic sound of summer is a song of the Willow Warbler. And this one, another one, which was again, I think there seems to be an increase in white throat as well in recent years. Last year, just hearing them everywhere, but particularly on the raised bogs, we're obviously focusing on just plenty of white throat. And again, beautiful to see another migrant that arrives here in April from sub-Saharan Africa and breeds here, and then returns to Africa in late summer. So all of these birds, the Grasshopper warbler, Willow Warbler, white throat, all obviously, the bog is a very different place at this time of the year, during the winter and into the early spring before our migrants have returned. But and then really comes to life during the breeding period, during the breeding season. Jay as well, one that you don't see that often, but you can hear quite a that's a ratchy call. So Jay, quite common on around the edges of Ardagullion, and then also woodcock, which was a great species to record, and we recorded them in really good numbers. And this was, as I mentioned, using specialized survey method, which is essentially at dusk, picking a location and then watching where there's a good view, watching over the surrounding woodland and the edge of the bog. And typically woodcock have long-ranging flights at the start of the evening when they're roading and when they're displaying, and we had picked up plenty of woodcock using those survey methods, which was fantastic to record. We didn't actually record any long-eared owl, and it was quite a poor year for long-eared owl last year, 2021, but we didn't record any long-eared owl in or around Ardagullion Bog. Not to say that they're not there, but they weren't obvious, or it wasn't possible to detect them last summer. So I just go back to woodcock. That was the final red-listed bird of conservation concern. So out of the 5 that we recorded, it was meadow pipit, woodcock, kestrel, and also redshank and snipe, the breeding waders. So woodcock being another, and you can see the distribution there quite limited as recorded by the breeding atlas. So that's the species that we're recording. I suppose just to put it into context, last year we while focusing on Ardagullion Bog, we also looked at 4 other raised bogs using the exact same method. So really interesting to compare. And the other sites as well are also part of the Living Bog Project, also being restored. So it's so we're able to kind of directly compare, and all really important sites in their own right as well. And so just to give you, because it's always good to as opposed to looking at it with blinkers on just at the single site, just to give you an idea. So where these sites are. So this is obviously Ardagullion there, and then the closest to it would be Killyconny in West Cavan, and then with 3 sites in Offaly for Banmoy, Clare and Mongan Bog. And so we're able to compare directly, and you can see Ardagullion, even though it was the smallest of the sites, it is really punched above its weight, and it really shows its importance. So it's 42 species, which was higher than most, just one under Killyconny Bog. In terms of red listed species, 5, which was similar to most for Ban and Mongan, had 6 species, had 1 more. In terms of the amber listed species, it had the most, and but probably really interesting what was in terms of the diversity index. So we looked at the diversity of species. Ardagullion Bog was the most diverse, more so than the other 4 sites. So it really is an incredibly important site for. And again, I'm only focusing on birds. It's for biodiversity in general, but obviously birds being really good indicators, and just you can see there just how important it is. And but so that was one element to it, but also it was really important to look at where we've seen just the different species that occurred, and on the bog, really important to look at where on the bog they occurred and what their habitat associations were, and that's important because we know that the bog has changed, and it's fair to say changed for the better in terms of an increase in the area of active living raised bog, and that's hopefully going to continue. So the condition of the bog is hopefully going to improve. So we wanted to look at what effect that would have on the different species, and for some it's going to mean that the bog becomes less suitable, but for others it's going to mean that it becomes more suitable. And so but what we've learned is that, as you can see here, so we looked at the active raised bog compared to the non-active raised bog, and we looked at the birds per kilometre in the different categories of their conservation status, red, amber and green. And what we see is that the active raised bog was more important for red listed species, and amber listed species almost twice as important for red listed species compared to the non-active raised bog. So that really that's really promising. So that bodes well in terms of with the the water table being restored, the area of active raised bog increasing, that is going to be likely or hopefully beneficial for those species that were really concerned about those red listed bird of conservation concern, the likes of the open habitat specialists, the likes of meadow pipit, the likes of skylark, the likes of the likes of snipe, the likes of redshank. And when we looked at at the individual species that we had, apologies, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself, that we had, really good information on, which is the ones that were occurring, in reasonably good numbers. Because say, for example, redshank, there was only a few encounters of birds occurred in very, very low densities, whereas meadowpipit, skylark, snipe occurred in higher densities. So it allows us to do more with the information. And we saw the same picture, and that bodes really well. That, say, for example, you can see meadowpipit there in red. They almost occurred twice the densities on the active raised bog compared to the non-active raised bog, which is promising then, looking at how the bog is likely going to change over time and for these species. So that's really important to know as well, and particularly because also in the context of Ardagullion, but other raised bogs, because there's really positive movements now to restore other raised bogs, and it's important to know, it's important to be able to assess, how that's going to affect the species that are dependent on these sites. So I've talked all about the species that we did record and that were present, but there's also some species that were quite notable in their absence, or at least when I say their absence, that we didn't record them. Now, some of these are, can be quite tricky to record, so to detect. So we can't say that they definitely weren't there, but I think it's fair to say that at least for two of these species, that based on the relatively small size of the bog, and based on the the detailed nature of our survey methods, that it's likely that they weren't present. And this is one of them, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is curlew, and that's another one similar to redshank. Its population is really at a critical stage. Their numbers, it's estimated around 200 pairs of breeding curlew, and so we were hoping that we would record curlew on Ardagullion Bog, but unfortunately not. We did record them on three of the other sites, the other raised bogs, but that's not to say that they can't occur there in future. And with the improvements to these sites, that's that's something that's that's really hopeful, that these sites they're hopefully only going to get better. Now, obviously, there's individual habitat requirements and for the different species, but in general, the fact that these sites are protected and are being restored, you would hope that we'll see some of these species that should be there, that but that weren't recorded may return in future. And we didn't record red grouse on Ardagullion. It's a species, for surveying for red grouse. Now is the time, essentially, kind of February, really peak time for surveying red grouse. And it's kind of towards the end of the year and into the very early start of the year. So but because we started our surveys in that start of April, it's kind of outside the window of the best time to detect red grouse. So that's one species that we can't say for certain aren't there, and indeed hopefully they are. We didn't see any signs of red grouses either, which you can find when they are present. But interesting to see the presence of red grouse on Ardagullion. And then another, which is Merlin, which is one of my favourite species in Ireland, and one that I've done quite a bit of work on. And we did really target the methods in order to detect Merlin if they were present, and we did detect them in some of the other raised bogs, but unfortunately no signs on Ardagullion. Now again, that's one, and the conditions seem suitable. There's good prey availability in terms of good densities of skylark, of meadowpipit, definitely suitable nesting conditions, but no sign of Merlin. But unfortunately, but again, that's not to say that they won't occur there in future and that the site isn't suitable for them. But in general, I think based on the information that we found in terms of the number of species present, the number of red listed and amber listed species present, and just the individual species present, and particularly species such as redshank, such as snipe, and the densities they occurred, it just shows just how important it is. And as I say, that the hope is that it will continue to improve for biodiversity generally and for birds over time. And it was just fantastic to be able to look at such a fine scale and such detail at the birds that are there. So just to say again, and to acknowledge and thank Mairead and Longford County Council, who supported the survey, and that was through the Longford County Council and with the support of the National Biodiversity Action Plan Fund, and also as well the Peatlands Community Engagement Fund. And without obviously that support, the survey wouldn't have been possible. And particularly thanks to Mairead, who supported the survey from the outset, and also the surveyors Isabel Oakes and also Laura Kavanagh, and the Living Bog team who we worked closely with and continue to do so, and also Orla Joyce and the Peatlands Management of the National